participation in communities that are largely disenfranchised. I'm here to talk to you about the economy and the state of South Africa, and we'll be having these conversations every quarter. There's lots of really interesting things happening in South Africa right now, and I think that many people are contemplating what the upcoming elections mean for the state of the economy, for our personal economic situations or financial situations. But before we get into that, I think it's really, really imperative for us to think about all of the bigger things that are happening. What we're seeing is a lot of large-scale investment in new industrial areas. We know that we're in an energy crisis. We also know that we as a country have embarked on this renewable energy investment program. And so we are seeing the establishment of a lot of renewable energy at the utility scale, which is very large scale renewable energy projects that are feeding into the electricity grid. We're also seeing the implementation of renewable energy at a smaller scale, particularly in higher income areas where people can fundamentally just afford solar or battery solutions. And what the renewable energy industry means for South Africa is that we're addressing two kind of competing objectives. The one objective that we are addressing is the electricity crisis. On the other hand, though, we are also contributing to the global movement related to decarbonization and climate change by investing in renewable energy. So a lot of people might have heard of the concept of the just energy transition. It's a global concept that speaks to a movement away from fossil fuel-based electricity generation towards renewable energy. And as a country, South Africa is starting to progress quite swiftly in becoming a global leader, particularly in the emerging markets, towards a just energy transition. The interesting narrative around the renewable energy projects and the JET program is that the communities that these projects are being typically implemented in are usually very rural, very underserved, and are embedded in the challenges that most of South Africans face every day: poverty, inequality, issues around food security and water security, and general access to economic activities such as access to education, access to jobs, access to financial solutions. And in light of the upcoming elections, what we are anticipating in these communities is a lot of protests. Protests fueled by the general situation that people find themselves in, but unfortunately targeted towards private sector investors, right? And this is a kind of a reality that we almost accept in South Africa. Typically, when we are unhappy with our circumstances, we tend to protest. Our protest is then directed towards those who are deemed more successful than us, or who have what we want. And in most cases, and we saw this in the KZN riots a few years ago, we see this in service delivery protests all the time, that infrastructure is damaged in these bouts of anger that we face collectively. And I think the challenge with that is because the large-scale investment that is being made in our country at this moment is coming or channeled from foreign sources, from the global north, essentially. The challenge we face is that in the protest action, our foreign investors are going to start getting the message that we don't necessarily want them to be here. And it's a very, very real concern that we as economists are currently grappling with and have been grappling with for the last 2.5 years, as we started considering the impacts of the general economic situation on the attractiveness of South Africa as an investment destination. So fundamentally what I am saying is that we need more than we want foreign investors to invest in our country, particularly in the energy sector, so that we can solve for our energy crisis. At the same time, we want to support communities in solving this particular crisis that affects most of us as South Africans. But but we can't have the one sort of one objective competing with the other objective, which is currently the situation we find ourselves in. It's a very, very difficult space to navigate, and what we're anticipating is, over the next 12 months, is this difficult process of us dealing with these on-the-ground protests, having to appease investors at the same time and convince them that South Africa is still a great investment destination, all while we're trying to navigate the global reality that we are anticipating a global economic downturn as a result of the increasing fuel prices, as a result of the ongoing war in the Middle East and the human rights violations, and understanding that the global economy is still recovering from essentially what was the global shutdown of COVID-19. So while all of that stuff is happening at a global scale, we're still fighting our own fight here locally and trying to maintain economic activity while understanding that there is community unrest anticipated, that there are elections coming up that fuel protest activities directly or indirectly. And we also now have to convince our global partners that we are still investable and still worth investing in. So the reality is no social grant is sustainable. Our government, our public sector has a certain pool of capital, a certain balance in their bank account. And every time they dish out, even if it's just 350 rands, there's less money available for other things, right? Increasing the social grant is going to mean that there's less money to spend on other things. The real mechanism with which to ensure that people have, access to well-being, so enough money to access education, access healthcare, and live a good, decent life, is to firstly, obviously, stimulate the economy so that we can create meaningful jobs, but also at the same time create economic systems within communities that afford communities to have access to basic, I want to say well-being services, so not social services necessarily, but well-being services. And why that's like an interesting conversation right now is because historically, right, and if we go back in time to pre-capitalism, particularly in the African contexts, communities know how to take care of themselves and take care of each other, right? There's a lot of work that was done in the well-being services that was not necessarily remunerated, but it was also not done in a begrudging fashion. And we know that the old African proverb says that it takes a village to raise a child. It was that kind of activity, child rearing, for example, that was not done for economic reasons, but for societal reasons. And I'm not saying that we now need to go back in time and all live in sort of rural settings so that we can raise our children in villages. But it's something to consider, the fact that we have released our humanity for a large portion for the chance at economic participation or for a social grant, which is not meaningful growth or progress for us as a society. So I'm going to take a step backwards, right? What the sort of dependency on the grant system has created on the ground, and we see this a lot in disenfranchised and excluded communities, is that for many people, when you're surrounded by where everybody in a community has never been employed for generations, there's a lack of knowingness on how to be employed, how to get a job, how to work, how to earn money. And we've created this sort of structural social dependency on social grants, right? And the worry always is, from a macroeconomic perspective, is that if we increase social grants, there's less impetus for people to learn how to work, right? Because if the social grants keeps you at a level of comfort, then there's little motivation for you to learn the process of working, learn the process of keeping a job, learn the process of sustaining that motivation while you might not want to go to work, right? at the same time, for those of us that are paying tax, because this pool of people that are reliant on social grants is ever increasing and increasing at the rate of at least the population growth rate in South Africa, it means that the pool of taxpayers will have to contribute more as time goes on. And the contribute more can come in the form of increased personal income tax. It could also come in the form of increases on VAT, like we've seen in the past, or increased taxes such as the sin taxes, so taxation on items in the economy that are deemed sins. It could be the increase of property taxes, it could be the increase of fuel taxes, it could be the increase of any taxes that make up our tax base. But essentially what it means for us that do pay tax consistently is that we will end up paying more. Transformation has occurred to a certain extent. It's occurred in that our regulatory system has evolved from pre-democracy days to now like a transformative state narrative. Transformation has occurred in that it has enabled Black people and historically excluded individuals from participating meaningfully in the economy. Transformation has worked in that, in these 3 decades since democracy, we have extremely wealthy Black families or non-white families in South Africa. We have people that have been able to create generational wealth in families that historically would have not been able to. But at the same time, the reality for people living in largely underserved, removed areas, their reality just remains the same. They might have improved opportunity and access on paper, but practically, not really. The real travesty over the last 30 years since the inception of democracy in South Africa is the decay of our education system. And yes, we have great educational models in the urban areas, but those educational models don't transcend our regional boundaries, right? They don't extend to the people that need the education the most. And it really calls into the question as to the meaningfulness of our transformational programs. So our transformational intentions in the policies remain great, but the execution of those intentions or the translation of those intentions into a programmatic action plan begs a lot of review and evaluation and questions and innovation actually for us to achieve the kind of upskilling education development that is required to propel all South Africans firmly into the middle class.